Hello my beautiful friends, welcome back to my channel. It is so good to have you back here again for a new episode. And if you were new here, hello and welcome. Why don't you stick around to see what kind of shocking but also very interesting true crime story I have for you today. And of course, please do subscribe to the channel. Now before I get into the story, I have to give out a channel disclaimer, and that is my channel is not meant to disrespect any of the victims or the families of the victims that I talk about in these videos. The information that I share with my audience is simply just research that I took from different sources of the internet and compiled into one YouTube video. The main purpose of my channel is for educational and awareness purposes of the different types of crimes we face on a daily basis. And the content warning is that in this case, I will be talking about violence and murder. So if you are sensitive to that type of content, then viewer discretion is very much advised. This week's case was actually brought to my attention by one of us, the person whose name you see on the screen right now. And actually I've heard about it before, but it sort of slipped my mind over the past few months. But thank you so much for bringing it up and reminding me about it once again. And for the rest of you guys, please stay with me. It's going to be a very wild one, so stay with me, okay? But other than that, sit back, relax, and let me tell you all about the tragic story of Melanie van der Merwe, more commonly known as Melanie Wallner. Melanie Wallner was the daughter of Peter and Jean van der Merwe, and she had a brother and a sister, and her father described her as someone who had a very bubbly personality, someone who was full of laughter. She was just the most amazing person you could come across. So what happened to her actually broke him into pieces. It broke his soul and his heart apart because she was the last person who could ever deserve anything like this. Melanie was a South African woman who was born in Pretoria, and after she graduated high school, she wanted to work a couple of jobs here and there so she could save up enough money to move to the UK and start a new life for herself there. Then in 1996, she finally met her financial goal and she was ready to move to London. And when she got there, it didn't take long for her to find a job working as a waitress. And in her workplace, she was a young woman with great strength and had the ability to take control of any situation she was in. Because of these qualities of hers, it came as no surprise when she managed to work her way up the ladder and she ended up being promoted to being the beverage and food manager. Then in 2000, Melanie met a man whom she would fall head over heels for, and this man's name was Peter Wallner. Peter Wallner was an only child who grew up in a small village in South Germany, and once he graduated high school, he started getting training to work as a chef at the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich. After his training, however, he managed to get himself into the army where he served as a paramedic for 3 years before going back to pursue his career as a chef. And it was said that Peter was actually thriving in the working environment of being a chef. And if you don't already know, that kind of environment is very high pressure. It needs a person to always be on their feet, always creatively thinking, and you have to be able to think on the spot as well. And Peter just loved doing that, and it worked for him. It really did. Before he relocated to the UK, he worked for a hotel in Munich for over 2 years, and he made a name for himself as an exceptional chef who always delivered results even when working under pressure. But once he got to the UK, it didn't take him long before he stumbled across a 24-year-old young woman by the name of Melanie van der Merwe. And that's because at that time, they were both working at the same hotel at the Marriott Regents Hotel in northwest London. And that is how their life together began. In 2001, just after a year of getting to know each other, both Melanie and Peter decided to get married, and they got themselves a cozy home in Hammersmith. And even at this point, they were still climbing higher in their respective careers. Peter was now a well-known chef who was treated almost like a celebrity, so he had made a very big name for himself. And Melanie was now working at the catering department of the House of Commons. And honestly, to everyone else, they seemed like the perfect couple. But even as they were going through their first years of marriage, they still had a few bumps here and there. As a matter of fact, it was said that Melanie was the type of person who was a bit naive when it came to matters of the heart, and even her parents were very questionable about her experience in that department, and oftentimes they weren't really big fans of her marriage to Peter. And since when she got married to Peter, her visa was about to expire, a lot of her friends and family in South Africa almost believed that the only reason she got married to Peter was so she could extend her stay in London, since Peter was a European national. But on the contrary, she was very much in love with Peter, and she would often write in her diary about her feelings for him. But in reality, she was the only one who had such strong feelings in their marriage. And honestly, their marriage was not as happy as most people believed it was. Oftentimes, Melanie would call her mom and she would complain about how strict Peter was. She would tell her that Peter would want things to be done in a certain and precise way, and he wouldn't allow her to buy things like shampoo because he believed that they were an unnecessary waste of money. But as frustrated as she was with the way her husband was, she still wanted their marriage to work out. So much so that she ended up thinking that she had to better herself so everything can be better, as if she was always the problem even when she wasn't. And a few more years into their marriage, they decided to move away from the city and they moved to Surrey, where Peter took a job at the Woodlands Park Hotel, and Melanie also worked at the same hotel as a food and beverage manager. The couple then rented a house in Hamilton Avenue, and they seemed like they were quite satisfied with this new move out of the city and away from the noise. However, this is when things started to go south even way worse than before, and even that little bit of happiness that was on the surface was beginning to come crumbling down. Because just before Melanie started working at the same hotel as Peter, Peter met a young woman there, a foreign exchange student who was working as a waitress who went by the name of Lilia Finneck. And whenever Peter saw Lilia, he just couldn't contain himself. So he ended up pursuing a relationship with her, and that's how their affair began. But of course, it didn't take long for Melanie to find out about this affair, but as heartbroken as she was, she still wanted to work on fixing their marriage. So she told Peter that he had to stop seeing this woman, and also they had to start going for marriage counseling to fix their marriage. Then Melanie made another decision to quit her job at the Woodlands Park Hotel because she believed that maybe working in the same environment as her husband was one of the causes of their problems. So maybe if she backed away for a little bit, things would get a bit better. Then after leaving that job at the Woodlands Park Hotel, she ended up finding a job at the Dislow Hotel, where she worked for a brief time. And on the other hand, Lilia moved back home to her home country in Malta, so Melanie believed that everything was finally going to get better because the other woman had now stepped away. But even though Melanie was showing so much commitment to bettering their marriage, Peter just couldn't care less. And as a matter of fact, while Melanie was busy feeling positive that their marriage is finally headed in the right direction, Peter was already looking for another woman to mess around with. And that's when he came across a woman by the name of Emma Harrison, who worked as a wedding planner in Woodland Park. And their affair wasn't really that much of a secret. A lot of people knew about it because they just didn't care to hide it at all. Then in August of 2006, Peter and Melanie went to a festival in Scotland, and this little vacation time made Melanie believe that everything was finally going to be better from there on out. Then on August 27th in 2006, they came back from the festival in Scotland, and when they got back, apparently Melanie received news that she was finally going to receive her British citizenship. And of course, she was ecstatic about it, and she couldn't wait to tell her family back in South Africa. So she texted her family about it, and they were talking about how they had to hold a small celebration to commemorate these great news. But alas, her family never knew that that was the last time they would ever hear from her. On September 1st in 2006, Peter called Melanie's family here in South Africa, and he told them that he had some bad news about Melanie. He said that he had been woken up by a loud crash downstairs, and when he went to go see what was happening, that's when he found Melanie on the floor, unresponsive. Peter also told them that he tried performing CPR on her, but nothing was happening. And then he called an ambulance, but unfortunately, Melanie was pronounced dead on the way to the hospital. Melanie's mom then requested to Peter that the family fly out to London so they can deal with this whole situation. And he agreed. But every time the family brought up the idea of seeing Melanie's body, Peter would just try as hard as he can to distract them away from that idea. He told Melanie's family that when Melanie was being put into the ambulance by the paramedics, her face got pretty roughed up very badly, and because of that, she was black and bruised, and he just couldn't let them see her that way. And when the family got to the UK, they noticed how cold and distant Peter was about this whole thing. But they thought that maybe that was his way of grieving the loss of his wife, so they didn't really press him that hard about it, and they didn't really ask him too many questions about what happened the night Melanie died. But still, whenever they would bring up the idea of seeing Melanie's body again, Peter would still shut that idea down. And then at one point, he said that he received a call from the coroner, and it was about the cause of Melanie's death. And he said that it was said that Melanie died from a brain aneurysm, so her death was simply just of natural causes. And seeing as how the family was still grieving at that time, of course, they took his word for it. Melanie's family accepted this terrible news about their daughter and sister, and as they were still grieving in London, Peter then went ahead to plan Melanie's memorial service in London. And it was planned that there was going to be 2 services, one here in London and then another one in Melanie's home country of South Africa. When it came to the one in London, the service held in London, it was held at the Disler Hotel where Melanie briefly worked. And about 50 people came in attendance. And it was said that Peter gave an emotional eulogy about Melanie, and still the people who came in attendance just couldn't believe that the person who had passed was really Melanie. And when Melanie's family decided that her final resting place should be in her home country in South Africa, Peter agreed. So when the family flew back to South Africa, Peter was going to fly back after them with an urn that contained Melanie's ashes. And when they had the second service in South Africa, even then, they recalled Peter being cold, distant, and he seemed not to be interested in talking about Melanie at all. And of course, a lot of the guests found this to be very weird, and it obviously was. And then soon after Melanie's funeral was conducted, Peter quickly went back to London, and he wasted no time in getting into a new relationship with Emma Harrison, the second woman he had an affair with. And it happened like that because just before Melanie passed away, Peter told Emma that he and Melanie had separated, and the only reason he attended the funeral now was because he felt like it was the right thing to do for her family. But Peter wanted Melanie's family to still believe that he was still grieving the loss of his wife Melanie, so he never even told them about his new relationship with Emma Harrison. And as a matter of fact, he once wrote a letter to Melanie's brother telling him about the anger he's feeling regarding the loss of his wife. Then when it came to matters of the death certificate of Melanie, Melanie's mom was asking for a copy of it to be sent to South Africa. But every time, Peter would just keep giving her excuses no matter what. And they didn't think to question him or be suspicious of him at this time because they still believed that he genuinely did love their daughter. And then in 2007, Peter told Melanie's family that he would fly to South Africa at some point to bring the copy of the death certificate to them. But when the time came for him to do that, he called them and told them that he couldn't come anymore because his father back in Germany had just suffered a heart attack, and so he had to go and see him. Then in 2008, Melanie's father, Petrus, arranged with Peter for them to meet up in London at the airport so he can get Melanie's death certificate, the copy of her death certificate. But when the time came for Peter to show up at the airport, he still never showed up. And he said that he had to go back to Germany again because this time his mother had suffered a stroke. And of course, like all good people do, Melanie's family was very understanding and sympathetic towards him about this whole thing. But Peter's girlfriend, Emma Harrison, was starting to become quite suspicious of him and always dodging Melanie's family, so much that she didn't really believe the story that his parents were sick in Germany. So when she started feeling like she could no longer trust this man, that's when she decided to leave the relationship. And after that, it didn't take Peter long before he got into a relationship with a new woman by the name of Rebecca Jackson. But even in this relationship, he was still in contact with Lilia Fennick, the first woman we talked about that he had an affair with while Melanie was still alive. And according to Rebecca, when she and Peter first met, he told her that his wife had just recently passed away, and so he wanted to take things a little bit slowly. But it turned out that Peter was just using Melanie's passing as a way to manipulate people and to get his way. But as the relationship went on, Rebecca ended up falling pregnant with their daughter. And even though this pregnancy was not planned, they started having talks about moving in together at Peter's house in Hamilton Avenue. But then when the time came for Rebecca to move in with Peter, he told her that he had to go back to Germany because his father had just died of a heart attack. And after he did that, he just wouldn't take her calls anymore, and he simply was just avoiding her. But once Rebecca finally managed to get a hold of him, he managed to manipulate the situation by saying that the only reason he wasn't allowing her to talk to him was because he was still suffering from the grief of now losing his father just recently after losing his wife. And after telling her this, they continued their relationship. But again, as the time came for Rebecca to move in with Peter, a few months after they've continued their relationship, he told her that he had to go back to Germany because this time his mother had suffered a stroke. And yes, as you may have guessed by now, none of this was true. Peter's parents were still alive and very healthy back in Germany. He just didn't want to get involved with Rebecca anymore. And as a matter of fact, just 6 weeks after their daughter was born, he finally told Rebecca that he wanted nothing to do with the both of them. And after this, a neighbor brought something to Rebecca's attention, and that was that Peter was actually having a secret relationship with a woman who worked as a police dog trainer by the name of Claire Trigid. But eventually, even at his work, Peter's issues of behavior caught up with him, and he ended up being fired from the Woodlands Parks Hotel. Then at one point, Peter had an outstanding parking ticket. And it was actually issued out in Melanie's name. And that's because even though it had been years since she died, Peter never changed the registration on her car. Melanie's mother got notice of this outstanding parking ticket, and of course she was quite surprised that even though it had been years since Melanie died, Peter never made the necessary changes that he had to make after Melanie's death. So she called Peter once again for him to send her the copy of Melanie's death certificate so she can make the necessary changes that were supposed to have been made after Melanie died. But again, Peter was still giving her excuses. But this time, Melanie's mother was just not gonna fall for it. So what she did was, she ended up contacting a person that she knew in the UK so that person can help her out with this. And that's when Melanie's mom, Jean, received a shocking revelation. It turned out that Melanie Wallner was not in any record of any hospital or morgue anywhere in London. And then around December 25th of 2008, when Melanie's mother tried to confront Peter about this, he just stopped taking her calls entirely. And by this time, 23-year-old Lilia Fennick was back in London again, and she and Peter had started to rekindle their relationship. And soon after that, she moved in with him at his home in Hamilton Avenue. But even though Lilia was already starting to make herself feel at home, there was one area in the property that she was not allowed to go to, and that was the garden shed. And Peter told her that there is nothing in there but an old freezer. And even though that really wasn't reason enough for her not to go in there, Peter still told her she's not allowed to. But then as time went on, Peter was unable to keep up with his rental payments for his rented house in Hamilton Avenue. And so the landlord told him and Lilia that they had to leave the property. And this is when Peter and Lilia moved back to her home country in Malta. And they were quite excited about this new move because Lilia was now going to be closer to her family a lot more, and Peter was also confident that it wouldn't take him that long for him to find a new job in Malta. Then finally, once Peter and Lilia were out of the property in Hamilton Avenue, the landlord decided to go do some inspecting to make sure that the house was ready for a new tenant. And then on June 6th in 2009, the landlord made a terrible discovery. When he was inspecting the property, he noticed that the garbage of the house was not collected at the front of the house. And so when he went on to see what was going on to investigate, he opened the wheelie bin, and once he looked inside through the trash, he then saw a human foot poking out of the trash, and immediately he called the police. And when the police arrived at the property and started looking through this wheelie bin, that's when they found the decomposing body of Melanie Wallner. And immediately a murder investigation was opened up. And since Melanie's body was already severely decomposed, they used dental records to identify her. And obviously, the main suspicion fell immediately on Peter Wallner. And when news reports were put out about the discovery of Melanie's body, that's when Peter knew that everything was about to come crashing down on him. And then he and Lilia went back to the UK after news of Melanie's murder were broken out. And when they got to an airport in London, that's when they were waited for by police, and they were both taken into custody. When Lilia was questioned about her involvement in this, she told the police that she was under the impression that they came back to London to help out with the investigation. But as they questioned her even more, they noticed that there simply was no evidence that she had anything to do with Melanie's murder. And so once she was released, she went back to her home country in Malta. And when investigators turned their attention to Peter to question him about Melanie's murder, Peter kept insisting that Melanie's death was just an accident, and he didn't mean to kill her. According to him, they were having an argument when Melanie tried to attack him, and he only defended himself. But what Peter didn't realize was, even though he was refusing to cooperate with investigators, they had already collected enough evidence against him to know that he was lying. And as a matter of fact, the evidence they collected was painting a pretty clear picture of what happened that night. You see, it all goes back to when they came back from their trip in Scotland on August 27th in 2006. When they were busy moving their stuff out of the car and into the house, Peter received a suspicious email from Lilia Fenwick from back when they were still just having an affair when Melanie was still alive. Then Melanie saw that email and was obviously very angry about it. So this led to them having an argument, but Melanie never got physical with him. As a matter of fact, she only went upstairs to sleep in a different bedroom. Then while she was sleeping, Peter snuck into the bedroom with an iron pan, and he struck her 3 times in the face, killing her instantly. He then wrapped her body in some plastic to prevent any blood from spilling onto the floor, and then he put her in the bathtub to clean her up. Then he went to the car and got the sleeping bag that Melanie was using at the festival in Scotland, and he put her in it, and that's when he put her in the garden shed. Which is why Lilia was never allowed to go anywhere near it when she moved in with Peter. Then he went back to the house, and then he cleaned off the blood from the bed. And then the next day, he just went on a date with Emma Harrison to celebrate his 31st birthday like nothing ever happened. And that's when he told Emma Harrison that he and his wife had officially separated. Then 2 days after that, Peter ordered a freezer, which was delivered to him a week later. And then he finally set it up in the shed, and that's when he put Melanie's decomposing body inside that freezer. And that is where Melanie's body was remaining hidden for over 3 years, from 2006 until it was found in 2009. And after killing Melanie, Peter knew that he had to cover his tracks. So remember that time when Melanie received news about her British citizenship? If you remember correctly, she was texting her family, telling them about it, and they were just talking about it, right? Well, her family was actually talking to Peter. He was the one who was texting her family, so they have no suspicion of what could have happened to her. Then after this, Peter tried to still cover his tracks by using Melanie's credit cards, and he used them until he got her into £7,000 worth of debt. And then after that, that's when he told Melanie's family about her untimely death. And when he decided to take charge of her memorial service in London, he was simply just trying to keep up an appearance as a husband who has just lost his wife and wanted to do one good final act for her before he never gets to see her again. And remember that urn that contained Melanie's ashes, which I might add was buried in the farm where Melanie grew up in South Africa? That urn wasn't containing Melanie's ashes. It was actually containing just ashes of some wood that Peter was using for his barbecue. So this man let Melanie's family believe that they were burying their daughter and sister that day, but they were only just burying nothing but pieces of wood. Then in spring of 2009, Peter wanted to finally get rid of Melanie's body, so he put her in the wheelie bin of the house that he took from the front of the house. And in his mind, he had this idea that the local garbage truck was just going to come and take Melanie's body off his hands. And yes, the garbage truck did come, but when the collectors tried to take the wheelie bin, and even when the hydraulic arm of the truck tried to lift it up, it was just too heavy. So the garbage collectors just left it there unopened because inside of it was Melanie's body. And of course, this led to Peter's former landlord discovering Melanie's body 3 weeks after it had been left there, which explains why it was so badly decomposed when investigators found it. During his trial, Peter pleaded guilty to manslaughter, but he pleaded not guilty to murder because he was sticking to his story that Melanie was the one who attacked him when she found out that he was cheating on her with Lilia Fenwick. He still claimed that her death was just purely accidental. He told the court that when they were arguing, he tried to move away from his wife by going upstairs, but she followed him and grabbed a pan, and when she tried to hit him with the pan, he took it from her, and that's when he hit her in the face, killing her. But to show that he was lying, investigators revealed one important piece of evidence. They showed that when Peter was trying to roll up her body onto a ground sheet, he didn't take off her sleeping mask, which showed that Melanie was actually still sleeping when she got killed in her bed. But he tried to defend himself by saying that he's the one who put the sleeping mask on her face because he just couldn't bear to look at her after knowing what he had done. But of course, the court didn't believe him one bit. The prosecution revealed that the motive behind Melanie's murder was that Peter was just greedy and wanted to sleep with other women, and Melanie was just simply in the way of him doing that, and that's when he decided that he had to kill her. And I don't know about you, but I very much agree with that. On June 4th in 2010, Peter Wallner was found guilty of all charges that were laid against him, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. But even though this was justice served for Melanie, we cannot take away the fact that her family will never get to see her again. And even the women that Peter was involved with also commented on how disgusted they were at the man that Peter actually was. They had no idea what kind of monster he actually was. But yeah, guys, that was the tragic story of Melanie Wallner, a woman who simply just wanted a happy marriage with a man that she loved. If only she knew what kind of monster she was actually living with. But we hope that her soul is resting in peace, and that we also hope that Peter is suffering wherever he is. And also, side note, if you no longer love someone, please just leave them. Please, because there is no happy ending for you in killing that person. You will get caught So just walk away, break up with the person, and just go find whoever you're looking for. But that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me again today. And also thank you to the person who brought this case to my attention. I am so sorry. I have no idea how to pronounce your name and I don't want to butcher it. But thank you so much for bringing it to my attention. And also thank you to you guys for getting me over 100 subscribers. You have no idea how much it means to me. Your support means the absolute world to me. Please, let's grow the channel. Tell your friends about it. Tell other people that you may know who like true crime about it. Share the videos, share the links. Let's just grow the channel and make sure that people know about these cases that happen in South Africa. But thank you guys so much. And again, if you are new here, please be part of the family and subscribe to the channel for more true crime content. That being said, I will see you guys in the next episode, and until then, take care of yourselves, enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.